Tonight, we're looking back at 3 accounts from the backcountry, stories of isolation, of the thin veil between the hunter and the hunted. These are the memories of men who walked into the green cathedrals of the American wilderness seeking peace, only to find something that has left them looking over their shoulders for the rest of their lives. So, turn down the lights, lock the door, and let's step into the trees. Part I, the Asylum of Ash. I've been holding on to this one for a long time. It's a weight I've carried since I was 25, back when my life was measured in trail miles and risk, was just a word I didn't fully understand. Before the mortgage, before the kids, before the man I am today. Back then, I was a different animal, reckless, maybe solitary. I had this ritual a few times a year. I'd head into the Appalachians alone. I'd find a trailhead that looked like a scar on the map, hike until the cell signal died, and then keep going until the trail itself vanished. I loved the feeling of being off the grid, a ghost in the Cherokee National Forest. My friends called it madness. I called it freedom. The second day of this particular trip started as a masterpiece. The air was crisp, the sky a bruised blue, and I hadn't seen a human soul in 36 hours. By mid-afternoon, the atmosphere shifted. To the west, the horizon began to swallow itself in dark, swollen clouds. It hiked through rain before. I thought I was prepared for a little weather. But as the temperature plummeted, I realized this wasn't a shower. This was an assault. The wind didn't just blow. It bent the saplings until they looked like they were bowing in prayer, and above me, the ancient canopy groaned as branches snapped, like dry bone. I was exposed, hiking at elevation with a metal-framed pack that felt like a lightning rod on my spine. I was soaked to the marrow, my boots heavy with mud, scanning the dense foliage for anything that offered a roof. And then, like a hallucination born of the rain, I saw it. Tucked away in a fold of the forest, partially reclaimed by the pines, was a small, one-story cabin. It was ancient, a relic of a forgotten homesteader or a long-dead hunter. The single window stared out like a cataract eye. I didn't hesitate. I sprinted through the deluge and threw myself against the door. Inside, the world went dim and dry. The air was thick with a cloying sour stench, a mix of wet rotten something older, but I didn't care. I stripped off my sodden layers, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was sparse, a skeletal cot frame, a rickety table, a lone chair. A stone fireplace stood on the right, choked with the gray ash of a fire that had gone out decades ago. I collapsed onto the floor in survival mode. The roar of the storm outside turned into a rhythmic drumming on the roof. I lay there for 15 minutes, just breathing. But as the adrenaline began to ebb, curiosity took its place. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. That's when the details started to bleed through. In the corner near the cot, there was a sleeping bag. It wasn't ancient. It was dusty, yes, but it was modern gear. There were water jugs and rusted cans on the table. Someone had been here. A base camp. But then the beam of my light hit the wall near the door. Scratches. Dozens of them. They weren't the random marks of weathering. They were frantic, deep gouges in the wood. No pattern. No order. Just a chaotic map of desperation. I walked to the door and looked at the latch. On the outside, there was a heavy metal bracket designed for a padlock. My heart did a slow, cold roll in my chest. There was no corresponding latch on the inside. This door didn't keep things out. It kept things in. I moved to the window. The glass was intact, but it was reinforced. Screws had been driven into the frame from the outside, pinning it shut, and around the interior edges of that glass. More scratches, deeper this time. The kind of marks made by fingernails and draw. Bleeding hands trying to pry a way out. I should have left. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run back into the storm. The sky was black, the rain was a wall of water, and I tried to tell myself this was all ancient history. The sleeping bag was stiff with age. Whatever happened here was over. I was wrong. It or pass. Mate, the storm reached a fever pitch. The rain so loud it felt like it was inside my head. And then, beneath the roar, I heard it. S.C. Rich. S.C. Rich. A scraping sound against the left exterior wall. I froze. Was it a branch? I racked my brain, trying to remember if any trees were close enough to touch the wood. Thump. Thump. Two heavy, deliberate impacts on the porch. Mate, those weren't the sounds of the wind. I stood up, my eyes locked on the window. I didn't want to look out. I was terrified of what might be looking in. I stood there for an eternity, paralyzed, until I started to convince myself I was just paranoid. It was an animal, a bear seeking shelter. Just a bear. Then, the door creaked. I watched the wood groan as something heavy leaned against it from the other side. The latch rattled, once, and then the pressure vanished. A cold realization washed over me. The door wasn't locked. Whoever was out there could have walked in at any second. But they didn't. They were circling. Mate. They were waiting. They didn't want to come in, they wanted to make sure I didn't come out. I didn't wait for a second sign. I began throwing my gear into my pack, my hands shaking so violently I could barely move the zippers. I had the sickening feeling of a trap closing. The glass behind me didn't just break, it exploded. I spun around as a flash of light turned the dim room into a blinding white void. Something had been hurled through the window. Before I could even scream, the cabin erupted. The walls, the floor, the ancient wood, it all went up in a predatory roar of orange flame. The heat was a physical blow, a wall of fire that scorched the air from my lungs. I lunged for the door. It wouldn't budge. It was jammed, braced from the outside. I threw my entire weight against it, screaming, and the hinges finally shrieked and gave way. I tumbled out into the mud in the rain, the night air hitting me like a cold shock. I ran. I didn't look back. I just sprinted into the darkness until something hit me from behind. A weight tackled me into the dirt. I was fighting for my life in the mud. I felt hands, human hands, clawing at my eyes, pulling my hair, trying to find my throat. The person on top of me was screaming. A high, manic sound that was lost in the thunder. I kicked, I gouged, I fought with a primal strength I didn't know I possessed until I finally threw him off. I scrambled up and bolted. Behind me, the man was still shrieking like a wounded animal. I looked back once and saw the cabin, a pillar of fire against the black forest, a literal beacon of hell. The image of that fireball is burned into the back of my eyelids. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs turned to water. I found a hollow beneath to fall and reason crawled inside, shivering, bleeding, and utterly numb. I stayed there for hours, a cornered animal waiting for the sun. I survived. I found a trail at dawn and eventually a road. I had second-degree burns on my arm and neck, a souvenir of a night that changed me forever. The police, they listened, but what could they do? The cabin was ash. The forest is vast. The roof of that cabin was metal. It was pouring rain. A structure like that doesn't burn that fast unless it's been soaked in accelerant. Someone had prepared the trap. They had been waiting for a guest. I don't hike alone anymore. I don't think I ever will. Part I, the iron cage. My name is James. This was 7 or 8 years ago, back when my friend Charles and I were in our early 20s and thought we were invincible. Charles was the kind of guy who lived for the edges of things. He spent his nights on niche urban exploration forums on Google Earth, hunting for dead places, abandoned factories, derelict hospitals, anything with a no trespassing sign. I was usually his only accomplice. We had the same high threshold for risk and the same low threshold for common sense. Like, one weekend, Charles sent me a screenshot. It was an old fire lookout tower, decommissioned decades ago, buried deep in a forest a few hours away. His plan was simple: hike out, climb the 70-foot steel frame, and spend the night in the cab at the top. I was skeptical. Usually, those things are fenced off or the stairs are removed to prevent idiots like us from falling to our deaths. But Charles was insistent. They mapped the whole thing out. We reached the tower on a Friday afternoon. Seeing it through the trees was like seeing the skeleton of a giant. It was a spindly, rusted tower of steel rising 70 feet above the canopy, topped with a small square room wrapped in glass. There was no fence, no signs, just the tower, waiting. The climb was a nightmare of adrenaline. The metal staircase zigzagged up the frame, and with every step, the structure seemed to groan in protest. Some railings were missing. Some bolts had rusted into nothing, making the steps wobble over the empty air. The final stretch was a vertical ladder encased in a narrow metal cage. By the time we reached the cab, my heart was hammering against my ribs. But the view. What? The view was a dream. We were above the world. As the sun dipped, the forest below turned into a sea of purple and black, stretching for miles in every direction. No city lights. No roads. Just us and the stars. We sat on the narrow walkway outside the cab, cracking a few beers, feeling like kings of the wilderness. But as the light died, the isolation started to feel less like a dream and more like a weight. The forest below was a void. Charles, sensing my unease, started messing with me, typical Charles stuff. But then, he took his metal water bottle and slammed it against the steel railing. Clang. The sound was deafening. It echoed out across the valley, a sharp, unnatural shriek of metal on metal that probably carried for miles. It felt like a flare. I got angry, told him to knock it off and headed into the cab to set up my sleeping bag. I was smoothing out my gear when Charles's voice drifted in from the walkway. It wasn't his usual cocky tone. It was quiet. Flat. James, get out here. I walked out, and he was pointing, diagonally down, into the black maw of the trees. At first, I saw nothing. Then a spark. A light was moving through the woods. It was faint, maybe a few hundred yards away, but it was moving. My first thought was a ranger or a hiker who'd heard the clang. I started whispering, panicking about getting arrested before that night. You think that's a person? Charles asked. I looked closer. The light wasn't swaying. It wasn't bobbing with the gait of a human carrying a flashlight. It was moving with a terrifying, liquid smoothness. It was gliding through the dense undergrowth at a steady, unwavering pace. It was heading straight for the tower. We watched in a trance of pure dread. The light didn't wander. It didn't hesitate. It moved with purpose. After 10 minutes, it reached the base. From 70 feet up, we looked straight down. The light stopped exactly at the foot of the stairs. We couldn't see a figure, just the glow, a cold, steady illumination that just sat there. Charles, in a fit of nerves or stupidity, leaned over the rail. Hey, you go down there. No answer. Right. The light didn't flinch. Hey, he yelled again. Silence. We would wrapped, 70 feet in the air with a single, vertical exit, and something was sitting on it. We watched that light for 30 minutes. It never moved. Eventually, I grabbed my own high-powered flashlight and aimed it straight down. The beam hit the forest floor. There was nothing there. No person, no lead, no source. But the mystery light. It was still there, visible to our naked eyes, unfazed by my flashlight beam. And then, as we argued about what to do, it vanished. Like, 1 second it was there, the next, total darkness. Charles tried to play it off. Probably just some prankster, he muttered. But I couldn't shake the feeling that being unable to see it was worse. Now, it was just down there in the dark. We retreated into the cabin, sat with our backs against the door. Neither of us was going to sleep. About 20 minutes later, the sounds started. They weren't footsteps. They were metallic. Play. A heavy impact against one of the support beams, deep below us. It sounded like someone hitting the tower with a sledgehammer. Then, a grinding sound, the screech of metal being twisted, a slow, agonizing groan of steel. The sounds moved. White. 1 second they were below us, the next they seemed to come from the side. We sat in the dark, huddled together, listening to our sanctuary being dismantled or toyed with. I was staring out the windows, watching the stars, when a shadow moved. It passed across the glass, a dark outline, silhouetted against the night sky. It was fast, a blur that blocked out the stars for a heartbeat and then moved to the next pane. I screamed. Charles scrambled back. We were 70 feet up. There was no walkway on that side of the cab. There was nothing but a vertical drop. Unless that thing could fly or climb like a spider, it shouldn't have been there. We didn't move until the sun cracked the horizon. As soon as the world turned gray, we threw our gear together. I swung the door open, half expecting a monster to be waiting, but the walkway was empty. The forest floor was empty. We started the descent, moving with a frantic, clumsy speed. We made it 3/4 of the way down when Charles stopped dead. "What?" I hissed. He just pointed. The next section of the staircase was gone. An entire 8-foot span of steel stairs had been deconstructed. The bolts were gone. The metal was missing. There was just a yawning gap between the landings. We had to jump. Charles went first, landing hard and twisting his ankle, his face pale with shock. I followed, the terror of the height replaced by the terror of what had happened during the night. We hit the ground and didn't look back. We didn't look for the missing stairs. We didn't look for the figure. What? We just ran for the car. I still talk to Charles, but we don't talk about that night. Not really. Because if we admit what happened, we have to admit that something followed us up that tower, and it didn't need the stairs to get to us. Part I, the gouged timber. I've been solo camping for 15 years. I'm in my late 30s now, and I'm a veteran of the backcountry. I know the risks. I know the sounds of the woods. And I always carry my hat. 308 bolt action rifle. 2 years ago, I headed into the Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky. 700,000 acres of rugged terrain. If you want to disappear, that's the place to do it. I was stressed, burnt out, looking for a 3-night reset. The first day was perfect. I hiked 7 miles in, set up near a creek, and watched the fire die down to embers. I was alone, just the way I liked it. I woke up at 2. Light, narrow am. Right, no reason. Just that sudden, jarring alertness that I looked at the wall of my tent and saw a faint, flickering orange glow. I unzipped the flap. About 200 yards away, through the screen of trees, a fire was burning. A campfire. It was small, controlled, but definitely human. I watched it for a while, expecting to hear voices or see a silhouette. Like, just the flames. I figured it was another camper who was being irresponsible with their embers. I went back to sleep. The next morning, I hiked over to the spot. I wanted to see who my neighbor was at. I found the clearing. It was exactly where the fire had been. But the ground was pristine. No ash, no scorched earth, no ray of stones. The leaf litter was undisturbed. a carpet of brown that hadn't seen fire in years. I stood there for a long time, the hair on my arms standing up. I knew what I saw. It watched that fire for 5 minutes, but the forest floor told a different story. I pushed on. I didn't want to let a hallucination ruin my trip. I moved deeper into a section of old-growth forest where the canopy was so thick. It felt like twilight, even at noon. It was an Irvingwong quiet. That night, I doused my fire early. I was in my sleeping bag when a sound tore through the silence. Crack, cut, cut. It was the sound of a massive tree splintering. A violent, sustained shriek of what followed by a resonant thud that vibrated through the ground beneath my sleeping pad. In the woods, a falling tree is a rare, awesome thing. But there was no wind. Night, no storm. The air was dead still. 10 minutes later, it happened again. From the opposite direction. The same gruesome crackling, the same earth-shaking impact. This one was closer, maybe 100 yards away. I sat up, my hand gripping the cold steel of my rifle, to trees falling in perfect weather, from different directions. That's not nature. That's something else. Then came the sound that broke me. It was a low, continuous rumbling. Not a growl, not a groan, but a mix of both. It sounded like something huge clearing its throat, a deep, vibrating resonance that went on for a full minute. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a mountain lion. It sounded intentional. I chambered around. The clack of the bolt was the only comfort I had got. I sat there for hours, aiming at the tent flap, waiting for the world to end. At dawn, I packed my bag in a fever. I had to see the tree. I had to know. I found it. A massive oak, 3 feet thick, lying across the slope. But as I approached the stump, I saw the damage. The tree hadn't snapped. It had been torn. The wood was pale and fresh, but it was covered in deep, irregular grooves. It looked like the trunk had been gouged, stripped and chewed by something with immense power and no tools. Like long strips of bark had been peeled away, and the wood underneath was shredded down. It wasn't a beaver. It wasn't a woodpecker. It was aggressive, messy, and impossible. My gut turned over. I felt a visceral, oily sense of being watched. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye near the fallen branches. A small pile of items. I walked over, my rifle raised. Sitting there, neatly placed on the dirt, was a blue bandana and a metal carabine. I felt my blood go cold. I reached for my pack and searched the side pockets. What? They were empty. Something had come into my camp while I slept. Something had taken my gear, moved 100 yards away, and left it at the site of a fresh kill. A tree it had shredded with its bare hands. I didn't walk back. I ran. I ran through the Daniel Boone for hours, the weight of my pack forgotten, the feeling of eyes on my back like a physical heat. I made it to my car by 3:00 p.m. and drove until I hit a city. I called the police, but what do you tell them? Like, that the trees are screaming, that something stole your bandana. I still go camping. I'm a stubborn man, that I don't go to the Daniel Boone. And every time I hear a branch snap in the night, I don't think wind. I think of those gouged trunks. I think of the thing that can chew through an oak tree just to let you know it was there. The wilderness is a beautiful place. We call it untouched. We call it pure. But perhaps we should remember why our ancestors built walls. Perhaps we should remember that when we go into the woods to find ourselves, we aren't the only ones looking. Sleep well. If you can, wake. Welcome to the podcast. Today, we are diving into 3 deeply unsettling accounts of isolation gone wrong. 3 stories where the search for solitude lead to terrifying encounters with the unknowness. These aren't ghost stories in the traditional sense. They are grounded in a terrifying reality. The realization that sometimes, when you think you've left the world behind, someone, or something, is waiting for you in the dark. So, lock your doors, turn down the lights, and let's step into the shadows. Tale 1. The Name in the Dark. Our first story takes us to the rugged, unforgiving coastline of Maine. To set the scene, the narrator of this story, let's call him Leo, for reasons that will become horrificously clear later, was 22 years old at the time. Picture where you were at 22. For Leo, it was a time of careless freedom. He was completely, devastatingly burnt out. He was grinding through a demanding job, but more than that, he was dragging around the heavy baggage of a colorful past. He doesn't go into the gritty details, but he makes it clear. He was actively trying to put thousands of miles, both physically and mentally, between himself and certain dark chapters of his history. He was living in a state of dissociation, where every day felt like a movie he was forced to watch, rather than a life he was actually living. What Leo craved was erasure. He just needed to vanish for a few days. We've all felt that urge, right? That desperate need to unplug, to step off the grid and let the world spin without us for a little while. Leo must have been wearing his exhaustion on his sleeve, because one afternoon at the office, a co-worker noticed. This co-worker started telling him about a tiny, speck of dust island situated off the coast of Maine. The way his co-worker described this place, it sounded aggressively, beautifully boring. There was no bustling nightlife, no tourist traps, no glowing neon signs. Most people who visited merely took the morning ferry out, walked the rocky beaches, and caught the afternoon boat back to the mainland long before the sun dipped below the horizon. The co-worker told Leo, if you stay overnight, it's like having the entire island to yourself. For a guy looking to disappear, those words were absolute magic. Leo immediately scoured the internet and found a vacation rental listing. It was a standalone cottage position right on the shoreline. The price was absurdly cheap, suspiciously cheap, and miraculously, it was available on incredibly short notice. Now looking back, any rational person might have paused. Cheap rent for an isolated cabin with no neighbors. That's usually the setup for a horror movie. But Leo wasn't in a cautious headspace. He was desperate. He clicked book, without a second thought. When he finally arrived, the reality of the cottage was far less romantic than the listing implied. It was cramped, basically a single, claustrophobic room containing a modest bed, an unused kitchenette that smelled faintly of old dust, and a bathroom no larger than a storage closet. The positioning of the cottage was what really set the mood. It was shoved back away from the water, entirely swallowed on three sides by thick, untamed brush that scraped stubbornly against the exterior walls. The front of the cabin faced the vast, dark ocean. Its only defense against the outside world was a single window, draped with a flimsy, semi-translucent curtain that offered zero privacy. The walls were dangerously thin. As Leo unpacked, he could hear the coastal wind whistling through the dry brush outside, sounding as though it were whispering right directly into his ear. There was one detail, however, that struck a discordant chord: the door. It was outfitted with a heavy-duty deadbolt and a thick, industrial chain lock. Both pieces of hardware gleamed. They looked brand new, recently installed. Why would a forgotten cottage on an empty island need fortress-level security? Leo noted the anomaly, shrugged it off, and moved on. He had taken the late afternoon ferry. As early evening rolled in, he spent his time simply wandering the island. There was a surreal, almost cinematic quality to watching the island slowly drain of human life. He watched the day trippers filter back onto the ferry, their voices fading over the water. By the time the sun bled out into the horizon, leaving behind a cold, bruised sky, the island was dead. There were no streetleted humming to life, no ambient roar of highway traffic, just a heavy, suffocating silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic, violent crashing of the ocean. Leo was alone. It was exactly what he wanted. Hunger eventually drove him to a small, dimly lit pub near the ferry landing, the only establishment seemingly open. The bartender was polite, wiping down the counter with practiced ease. But when Leo made offhand conversation and mentioned the specific shoreline cottage he was renting, the bartender's hand stopped. Her expression shifted. It wasn't quite fear, but it was a distinct look of bewildered concern. She didn't say a word, just offered a tight smile and went back to cleaning. On the dark, quiet walk back to his rental, Leo's path took him past a small hidden cove. Maybe 100 yards down from his cottage, bobbing gently in the black water, tied to a decaying wooden dock, was a single motorboat. It was painted a stark blue. It caught Leo's eye immediately because it didn't belong. Every other vessel he had seen that day was a weathered, heavy-duty lobster boat. This was small, sleek, and personal. He made a mental note of it and kept walking. By 10:30 p.m., Leo was safely inside the cottage. He slid the deadbolt into place. With a heavy metal clack, he secured the chain lock. He was ready to sink into the quiet. But modern life has a funny way of ruining peace. Leo reached for his phone and realized the charger was completely dead. Or maybe the ancient electrical outlets in the cottage were busted. He spent the next 20 minutes frantically moving from socket to socket, watching his battery percentage tick down into the single digits. It was a lost cause. Within the hour, his phone would be a useless brick of glass and metal. Normally, this would spark panic, but Leo rationalized it. He had a physical ticket for the ferry the next day. He didn't need to call anyone. Nobody even knew he was here. He surrendered to his exhaustion, crawling into the stiff bed. The accumulated fatigue of his burned-out life crashed down on him, and he was asleep within minutes of his head hitting the pillow. Then came the awakening. Have you ever been jolted awake in the dead of night? Your eyes flying open, your body instantly rigid, even though you don't know what woke you. Your primitive brain recognized a threat before your conscious mind could process it. Leo lay there in the pitch black. The cottage was freezing. And then he heard it. Crunch. Wait. Crunch. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps striding across the loose gravel directly outside the cottage. They were closed it before that night. Horrificously close. Whoever was out there wasn't just walking by. They were taking their time. There was an agonizing, drawn-out pause between each footfall. A 3-second wait. Crunch. This wasn't a stray dog or a raccoon rummaging for scraps. The cadence was entirely, terrifyingly human. Leo, holding his breath until his lungs burned, made a microscopic adjustment in the bed. Just a tiny shift of his weight on the mattress. Instantly, the footsteps outside ceased. The silence that rushed into the cabin was suffocating. It was thick and heavy, pressing down on Leo's chest. He lay frozen, staring up into the invisible ceiling. Minutes dragged by like hours. His mind raced, desperately trying to build a bridge of logic. It's an animal. It's just an animal. You're sleep deprived. You're imagining things. He willed himself to believe the lie. He lay perfectly still, terrified that if he moved, he would break the spell. And then, the illusion shattered. The footsteps returned. This time, there was no aimless wandering. The sound was purposeful, aggressive, and moving directly toward the front door. They stopped right on the other side of the thin wood. Leo's heart was hammering so violently against his ribs, he thought the intruder might be able to hear it through the walls. He was paralyzed. Suddenly, a blinding beam of white light pierced the thin, translucent curtain covering the window. The person outside had clicked on a high-powered flashlight, pressing the beam right up against the glass, sweeping the interior of the tiny room. Leo didn't dare blink. He lay rigid in the bed, praying the shadows concealed him. The light clicked off. The darkness rushed back in. Then, the mechanical click of the exterior or handle turning. The intruder pushed it. The heavy deadbolt engaged, holding firm. Leo squeezed his eyes shut, a silent prayer echoing in his mind. Please let it hold. Please let that be enough. It wasn't. After a beat of silence, the intruder tried again, this time throwing their bodily weight against the door, though it groaned under the pressure. Then came the banging. Bang, bang, bang. Brutal, punishing strikes against the door. The explosive noise in that tiny, confined space was deafening. Leo's body physically violently flinched. But the sheer violence of the assault finally snapped Leo out of his paralysis. The threat was real, it was imminent, and lying in bed meant waiting to become a victim. Fueled entirely by adrenaline, he rolled out of bed, his bare feet hitting the cold floorboards. He scrambled across the dark room while the door rattled on its hinges, and he crouched down low, right against the wall next to the door. He braced his body, preparing for the wood to splinter, preparing for the fight of his life. But the door didn't break. Instead, the hammering abruptly stopped. The silence returned, ringing in Leo's ears. He knelt there on the floor, clamping a hand over his mouth to muffle the sound of his own ragged breathing. Then, from just inches away, separated only by an inch of cheap wood, a deep, unfamiliar man's voice spoke smoothly into the night. I know you're in there, Leo. Leo's blood turned to ice. A dizzying wave of nausea washed over him. He almost screamed out loud from the sheer shock of it. It was a stranger's voice, but the stranger knew his name. He knew he was in there. Slowly, methodically, the footsteps moved away from the door. They began to scrape along the side of the cottage. Leo tracked the sound in the dark, listening as the heavy boots crunched past the thin bathroom wall, rounding the back corner. The stalker was doing laps. He was circling his prey. He was taunting him. For Leo, this was the absolute lowest point of terror. The anonymity of a random break-in is horrifying, but being specifically targeted, being hunted on a deserted island by a nameless, faceless voice who knows exactly who you are, that is true psychological torture. For an indeterminate amount of time, maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour, the slow, agonizing prowl continued around the perimeter of the cabin. A part of Leo's mind fractured, internally screaming at the man to just kick the door down and get it over with. The anticipation was worse than the violence. Finally, miraculously, the footsteps began to recede. They crunched away from the cottage, growing fainter. Minutes later, from the direction of the dark cove down the shoreline, the distinct, sputtering cough of a small outboard motor ripped through the silence. Leo listened as the engine revved, the sound slowly fading away across the black, open water, swallowed by the ocean. Leo did not sleep a single second for the rest of the night. He sat in the dark, clutching his knees, staring at the door, until the edges of the window began to turn gray with dawn. The moment there was enough light to see, he unlocked the door and stepped outside. The gravel surrounding the cottage was a canvas of terror. Deep, heavy boot prints formed a tight, continuous circle around the cabin, overlapping each other from multiple laps. Following the trail, Leo saw the prints break away from the circle, leading in a perfectly straight line away from the cottage, heading directly toward the small cove. They ended abruptly at the waterline, exactly where the blue motorboat had been tied up the night before. The goat was gone. The rest of the morning was a blur of adrenaline-fueled panic. Leo dropped the key with the property owner, boarded the first ferry to the mainland, and fled back to his life. But he couldn't leave the terror behind. Think about the sheer, horrifying logistics of this scenario. Whoever was outside the cabin did not live on the island. They had navigated open ocean in the pitch black of night, in a small motorboat, to reach that specific shoreline. They knew which specific, isolated cottage to approach. They knew which specific night Leo would be there. And most terrifyingly of all, they knew his name. Days later, a frantic Leo cornered his co-worker, the one who had casually recommended the island in the first place. What? He demanded answers. But the co-worker was genuinely, visibly horrified by the story. He swore on his life he hadn't breathed a word of Leo's travel plans to a single soul. Leo believed him. The fear in the man's eyes was too real to be faked. Leo admits he has a past that might make him a target. He isn't entirely shocked that someone out there might hold a grudge. But the mechanics of the stalking defy logic. How do you track a man who leaves no trail, who books a last-minute rental on a whim, to a forgotten rock in the middle of the ocean? How long had this phantom been watching him? Leo still lives in the same city. He still works the same job. Every day is a carbon copy of the last night. Nothing has happened since that night on the island. But when you know someone is capable of finding you in the dark, at the edge of the world, whispering your name through a locked door, wait, you never truly feel safe again. Tale 2. The Warm Walls of Hazime. Let's shift gears and move to the other side of the globe. This story takes us back over a decade to the coast of Nagasaki, Japan. Our narrator was a graduate student in structural engineering, neck deep in a highly technical, incredibly dry thesis focusing on the degradation of concrete in marine environments. It's the kind of hyper-specific academic niche that bores most people to tears. But for him, it was a golden ticket. It led him to an academic conference in Nagasaki, and more importantly, it connected him with a local expert named Dr. Yamamoto. Dr. Dai. Yamamoto had spent his career studying post-industrial decay. Recognizing a shared obsession, the doctor pulled a series of complex bureaucratic strings and gifted the narrator something urban explorers would kill for. An exclusive, unrestricted research permit for Hazime Island. If you aren't familiar with Hazime, you have likely seen its haunting silhouette in photographs. Rising violently out of the ocean, the island looks exactly like a massive, concrete battleship. In its prime, it was a booming coal mining facility, holding the title for one of the most densely populated pieces of land in human history. Thousands of workers and their families were packed into towering concrete apartment blocks that stacked on top of one another like a dystopian jigsaw puzzle. But in the 1970s, the coal dried up. The corporation running the island packed up, and everyone left. The island was abandoned to the elements. For decades, the salty sea air and violent typhoons have been eating away at the city, turning it into a rotting, crumbling monument to industrial collapse. Today, Hazime is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. You can take a tourist boat there, but access is fiercely restricted. Tourists are confined to a narrow, heavily reinforced concrete walkway along the outer seawall. Entering the actual buildings is strictly, legally forbidden. The structural integrity of the rotting high-rises is so compromised that a stiff wind could theoretically bring a ceiling down on your head. But our narrator wasn't a tourist. Armed with his permit and an exhaustive stack of legal waivers, absolving the Japanese government of liability if he was crushed to death, he was granted access to the forbidden zones. On the morning of the expedition, he boarded a small, private vessel. His only companion was his official escort, a government employee named Takashi. Takashi was a man of few words, exuding an aura of profound irritation. He clearly viewed this assignment as a miserable chore. The narrator didn't care. He was buzzing with adrenaline. Approaching Hazime by water is a deeply unsettling optical illusion. From afar, it looks insignificant, a tiny gray smudge on the blue horizon. But as the boat draws closer, the sheer, oppressive scale of the place violently snaps into focus. The monolithic sea wall, the hollowed-out windows of the apartment blocks staring down like thousands of dead, empty eyes. It is a true wonder of the modern world, entirely devoid of life. Stepping onto the decaying dock, Takashi delivered a sharp, uncompromising briefing. The rules were absolute. Stay on designated concrete paths. Do not breach areas marked with red warning tape. Do not remove artifacts. And above all else, stay within visual range of me at all times. Takashi repeated that last rule twice, his eyes narrowing. Outfitted in heavy, reinforced work pants, steel-toed boots, and a hard hat, the narrator set to work. The first few hours were an absolute dream for an engineer. He was meticulously photographing spalling concrete and exposed, rusted rebar. Takashi trailed behind him at a distance, constantly checking his watch, sighing heavily. Around midday, they entered the cavernous mouth of one of the massive residential blocks. The concrete stairs inside were miraculously intact, though gaping holes in the landings offered dizzying views of the floors below. Oddly, despite his strict warnings about staying in visual range, Takashi planted himself on the ground floor, gesturing vaguely for the narrator to proceed upward alone. It was hypocritical, but the narrator wasn't about to complain about losing his shadow. He climbed to the 4th floor. The air inside the building was thick, stagnant, and choked with decades of undisturbed dust. He was examining a fascinating section of wall, where the concrete had violently sheared away from the steel skeleton, when his eyes caught an anomaly on the floor. The dust was wrong. In a sealed, abandoned building, dust settles in an even, uniform blanket. But here, cutting sharply down the center of the hallway, was a distinct, trampled path. It wasn't fresh. The edges of the footprints had blurred as some dust had settled back over time, but it was undeniable. Someone, or something, had been walking this specific route, regularly, long after the island was evacuated. The trail led directly to a single, closed door at the far end of the dark corridor. Logic, self-preservation, and basic common sense dictated that the narrator should immediately return to the ground floor and alert Takashi. But curiosity is a powerful, dangerous narcotic. He knew Takashi would just pull the plug on the expedition and force him back to the boat. So, moving with agonizing slowness, he followed the disturbed dust. He reached the end of the hull and pushed the wooden door open. It groaned on rusted hinges. Stepping into the room, he was immediately assaulted by two profoundly unsettling sensations. First, the smell. It was entirely alien. It wasn't the smell of damp rot, or ocean salt, or rusting metal, but it also didn't smell like any human odor he had ever encountered. It was sharp, chemical, and distinctly organic, twisting his stomach into knots. Second, as he reached out to steady himself in the dim light, his bare hand pressed against the concrete wall. It was hot. Not just slightly warm. It was radiating a distinct, unnatural heat, drastically warmer than any surface he had touched all morning. He stood frozen in the center of the room for 30 seconds, his brain desperately churning out rationalizations. It's thermal mass, he told himself. The concrete absorbed the morning sun, but he looked up. The ceiling was completely intact. The room was cast in deep shadow. No sunlight was reaching this wall. Maybe animals, but nothing lived on as me. The island was a barren rock with no fresh water source. Thoroughly unnerved, he backed out of the room, hurried down the treacherous stairs, and found Takashi leaning against a pillar on the ground floor. When he described the path, the smell, and the radiating heat, Takashi's reaction was bizarre. He didn't ask a single follow-up question. He didn't look surprised. His face hardened into a mask of aggressive denial. Impossible, Takashi snapped in broken English. No humans here. No animals here. But when the narrator demanded Takashi follow him upstairs to feel the wall and smell the air for himself, Takashi flatly, angrily refused. He wouldn't even look toward the stairwell. His obstinate refusal wasn't born of laziness. It looked suspiciously like fear. The tour continued, but the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. The narrator's senses were dialed to maximum. Now that he knew what to look for, he started seeing it everywhere. Subtle, inexplicable anomalies. A piece of scrap metal moved from its rusted outline on the floor. Faint scuff marks on a stairwell that hadn't been there 50 years ago. He was seeing the ghostly fingerprints of habitation, but he still couldn't decipher if the phantom was human or feral. He pointed out another strange mark to Takashia. This time, the escort didn't even bother to respond in English. He immediately unclipped a heavy two-way radio from his belt, a device he hadn't touched since leaving the mainland, and began barking rapid, urgent Japanese into the receiver. The narrator had no idea what was being said or who was on the other end of the line. When the transmission ended, he demanded to know what was happening. Takashi, without making eye contact, lied through his teeth. Checking the ferry schedule, he muttered. The air on the island suddenly felt thick with malice. Takashi knew something. He knew what was lurking in the rotting concrete, and he was actively covering it up. In the mid-afternoon, they arrived at a towering residential block situated near the dead center of the island. For the first time all day, Takashi hesitated. He stopped dead at the entrance, staring into the pitch-black maw of the stairwell for a long, heavy moment before finally following the narrator inside. They climbed high, 5 agonizing flights of stairs. The air grew thinner, the shadows deeper. Unlike before, Takashi stayed glued to the narrator's heels, his previous indifference entirely replaced by a tense, hyper-vigilant energy. They stepped onto the 5th floor, landing unwalked into a corner apartment. The walls had partially collapsed, letting in slashes of pale sunlight. And there, illuminated in the dust, was the absolute, undeniable proof. Pushed against the far wall was a crude, makeshift nest. It was a thick pile of heavily soiled, modern blankets, clustered around the edges of the bedding worse, ever empty, plastic water bottles. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't a trick of the light. Someone was living on the Forbidden Island. The narrator gasped, a cold sweat breaking out across his neck. He spun around, ready to shove the evidence right into Takashi's face, ready to demand an evacuation. But he was talking to empty air. Takashi was gone. There had been no sound of footsteps retreating down the hall. Light. No warning. The escort had simply vanished into the labyrinth of the building. The visual shock of the squatter's nest hadn't truly terrified the narrator until that exact second. The realization slammed into him like a physical blow. I am alone up here, and there is someone else on this island. A primal, electric panic hijacked his nervous system. He felt an intense, psychosomatic itching spreading under his skin, a desperate urge to tear off his heavy safety gear and sprint. He lunged out of the apartment, rushing back to the stairwell they had just ascended. He was going to abort the mission, run to the dock, and get off this cursed rock. He rounded the corner to the stairs and slammed on the brakes. The stairwell was gone. Where there had been a clear path just minutes prior, there was now a massive, impassable mountain of shattered concrete and twisted rebar spilling completely across the landing, violently blocking the descent. Had the ceiling spontaneously collapsed the moment they walked past? Or, and this thought made his blood run cold, had someone, or some group, intentionally triggered a collapse to trap him on the 5th floor? There was no time to analyze the structural failure. Panic took the wheel. He spun on his heels and ran blindly down the corridor, praying the massive building had a secondary fire escape. As his steel-toed boots clattered violently against the concrete, the sound echoing through the dead halls, he heard it. From the darkness of an intersecting hallway behind him, movement. It was the sharp, distinct sound of a foot stepping out onto the debris-covered floor. The narrator didn't look back. Looking back meant death. He pumped his arms, sprinting faster, ignoring the burning in his lungs. But past him as buildings are a sprawling, interconnected maze. Every hallway looked identical, rotting doors, peeling paint, endless gray. He was running in circles, his sense of direction completely shattered by terror. And the entire time, he could hear the footsteps maintaining pace behind him. At first, he desperately hoped it was just Takashi trying to catch up. But as he sprinted past an open elevator shaft, the acoustics shifted. He could hear the footfalls clearly now. It wasn't one person. Clatter, scrape, clatter. It was a chaotic, overlapping rhythm. Multiple sets of footsteps, a pack of them, and they were hunting him. Driven entirely by raw, animal terror, he threw himself around a final corner and practically tripped over a secondary, narrow stairwell. He didn't climb down. He practically threw himself down the jagged concrete steps, bouncing off the walls, tearing his gear, risking a broken neck to escape the things in the dark. He burst out of the ground floor into the blinding daylight. He didn't stop running. He tore across the open courtyard, kicking up clouds of toxic dust, his eyes locked on the ocean. When he reached the dock, his lungs screaming, he found Takashi. The escort was casually leaning against a rusted bollard, arms crossed, staring blankly out at the water. He looked completely, utterly unfazed. The stark contrast between the narrator's near-death panic and Takashi's bored indifference acted like a spark to a powder keg. The narrator's terror instantly transmuted into blinding rage. He closed the distance, screaming at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing off the seawall. He screamed about the blankets. He screamed about the footsteps. He screamed about being abandoned, accusing Takashi of deliberately causing the cave-in to trap him. Takashi didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, letting the American scream until his voice cracked and gave out. The narrator wanted to physically grab him, to shake the truth out of him, but the agonizing reality of the situation held him back. Takashi was the captain of the boat. He held the key to survival. When the silence finally returned to the dock, Takashi slowly turned his head, looked through the narrator as if he were a ghost, and said 2 words. "We leave." The boat ride back to Nagasaki was a masterclass in psychological torture. The narrator sat in the stern, gripping the rails until his knuckles turned white, his eyes darting between the receding silhouette of Hazame and the back of Takashi's head. He was convinced Takashi was part of whatever cult, syndicate, or feral community was living in those ruins. As soon as his boots touched the mainland, he ran. He found a secure phone and furiously dialed Dr. Yamamoto's number, desperate to report the massive security breach, to expose whatever horrific secret Takashi was guarding. The phone rang. Andre. Bite. 2 weeks later, back in the safety of the United States, the narrator was still trying. He contacted the university. He contacted the research board. Dr. Yamamoto was gone. It was as if the man had been completely erased from existence. The narrator tried filing reports with the Japanese authorities, but the emails vanished into the void. Without Yamamoto's backing, he was just a hysterical foreigner spinning ghost stories about an empty island. It's been over a decade. The narrator still wakes up in cold sweats, thinking about the warm concrete. But the true horror isn't what chased him through the dock. The true horror is the silence that followed. He realized too late that dark drive. Yamamoto hadn't just arranged a permit. He had arranged a trap. And the narrator will spend the rest of his life wondering what would have happened if he hadn't found that second stairwell. Tale 3. The Mimic of North Brother Island. Take a deep breath. Our final story brings us back to American soil, dropping us directly into the dark, churning waters of New York City's East River. The narrator here was a college senior majoring in history. Much like the engineer from Hazame, he had a morbid fascination with the forgotten. His senior thesis was an exhaustive deep dive into abandoned institutional spaces, specifically decaying asylums, defunct hospitals, and ruined rehab centers festering just out of sight within major urban centers. His crown jewel of research was North Brother Island, If you live in New York, you might not even know it exists. It is a 20-acre piece of land sitting squarely in the East River, sandwiched between the Bronx and Rikers Island. It is heavily forested, aggressively overgrown, and completely, legally inaccessible to the public. Its history is steeped in misery. In the late 1800s, it housed Riverside Hospital, a grim quarantine facility for patients suffering from highly infectious, lethal diseases like smallpox and tuberculosis. It's most famous for holding Typhoid Mary against her will until she died. Later, it was repurposed as a bleak rehabilitation center for heroin addicts in the 1950s. Plagued by corruption and failure, the facility was shuttered in the 1960s. Since then, the city locked the doors, threw away the key, and let nature consume the island. Armed Coast Guard vessels patrol the waters. If you are caught setting foot on North Brother Island without a heavily vetted city permit, you face immediate arrest. Our narrator knew this. He had zero intentions of breaking the law. It was just an academic exercise. But alcohol and the arrogance of youth are a dangerous cocktail. White, while sharing drinks with his two close friends, let's call them Jansen and Jesse, he began venting about his thesis. He told them the morbid history of North Brother. He painted a picture of crumbling morgues and ivy-choked hospital wards, rotting just a few miles from where they currently sat. Jansen and Jesse weren't history buffs, but they were deeply embedded in the urban exploration subculture. That edgy, adrenaline-chasing hobby where young men break into condemned properties to take moody photographs. The moment they realized there was a forbidden, post-apocalyptic ghost town sitting right in the middle of the East River, their eyes lit up. They relentlessly pressured the narrator. Wait, you're writing a thesis on it. How can you write about it if you've never breathed the air? Eventually, the pressure and his own buried curiosity won out. A few weeks later, at 2:00 on a freezing night, the three college students found themselves dragging three heavy solo kayaks through the dark, manicured grass of Barretto Point Park in the Bronx. This specific park offered one of the few shorelines where they could silently slip into the water without immediately attracting the attention of police patrols. The paddle to the island was roughly a half-mile across the treacherous currents of the East River. The plan was airtight in its stupidity. Launch at 2:30 am, navigate the pitch-black water, explore the ruins under the cover of darkness for a few hours, and paddle back before the sun exposed them. Slipping the kayaks into the freezing, inky black water was eerily easy. The Bronx shoreline was dead quiet. But the moment their paddles broke the surface of the river, the reality of the crime settled heavily into the narrator's stomach. They were adrift in a major shipping channel, in the dark, heading toward a cursed island. Despite the nerves, they made landfall. Pulling the heavy kayaks onto the shore of North Brother was a brutal, chaotic struggle. Decades of unchecked overgrowth had turned the shoreline into an impenetrable wall of sharp reeds, aggressive vines, and rotting driftwood. They fought the vegetation in silence, terrified of making too much noise, until they found a small muddy depression to hide the boats. Standing on solid ground, the three young men switched off their flashlights for a moment to let their eyes adjust. The most shocking element of North Brother Island isn't the ruins. It's the silence. They were geographically standing inside the borders of New York City. The glowing skyline of the Bronx was visible through the dead trees just a half-mile away. Yet, on the island, there was absolutely no ambient city noise. Like, the dense, overgrown canopy swallowed sound entirely. It felt like they had paddled off the edge of the earth. Clicking their heavy flashlights back on, the trio pushed inland. Jansen and Jesse were immediately humbled by the sheer scale of the ruins. The narrator had shown them maps, but seeing the massive brick structures rising out of the suffocating vines like ancient Mayan temples was a different beast. Buildings were literally tearing themselves apart as massive oak trees grew directly through their foundations, splitting brick walls in half. Jesse stood in the center of a ruined courtyard, panning his flashlight over a collapsed hospital wing. "It looks like a post-apocalyptic video game," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. He was right. Nature hadn't just reclaimed the island. It had violently digested it. They moved methodically through the first few structures, the beams of their flashlights cutting through thick dust, illuminating rusted iron bed frames and collapsed ceilings. It was thrilling. But then, in the cavernous main hall of what used to be a patient ward, Jansen kicked something on the floor. It clattered loudly against the concrete. He bent down and picked up a rusted, half-empty can of spray paint left behind by some previous rest bars. A massive grin spread across Jansen's face. He immediately shook the can, the metal ball rattling violently in the dead silence, and stepped toward a relatively clean stretch of brick wall. Jesse laughed, encouraging him. The narrator physically stepped between them. "Don't," he hissed. He wasn't acting like a hall monitor. He felt a sudden, oppressive wave of disrespect. People had suffered here. People had been imprisoned here. Hundreds of people had died terrifying, agonizing deaths in these exact rooms. Spraying tags on the walls felt like spitting on a grave. Jansen rolled his eyes, sweeping his flashlight over the walls to reveal layers of elaborate, faded graffiti left by decades of intruders. "It's already trashed, man. Like, one more tag isn't gonna wake the dead." The narrator didn't have the adrenaline left to argue. Disgusted and deeply unsettled, he told them he wasn't going to stick around to watch. He turned his back on his friends and began walking deeper into the labyrinth of the hospital complex alone. It was a catastrophic mistake. In the urban exploration community, there is a golden rule: never split up. When you are with a group, the collective presence creates a psychological buffer against fear. You can laugh off a strange shadow. You can rationalize a weird noise. But the second you isolate yourself in a decaying, lightless ruin, your brain turns against you. The silence becomes predatory. The narrator wandered down a long, impossibly dark corridor. The floor was slick with moss and rotting plaster. He was trying to memorize architectural details for his thesis, but his heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had walked perhaps 50 yards when he heard it. "Hey," it was Jesse's voice. It echoed sharply down the corridor, coming from one of the pitch-black patient rooms ahead of the narrator. The narrator jumped out of his skin, his flashlight beam shaking wildly. He exhaled a shaky breath, annoyed that his friends had managed to sneak around him. But as his logical brain caught up, a cold knot formed in his stomach. The layout of the hospital didn't support this. For Jesse to be calling from a room ahead of him, he would have had to immediately sprint away from Jansen the second the narrator left, navigate a completely different, unlit wing of the hospital, bypass the main corridor, and arrive in that forward room in absolute silence. It made our logistical sense. The narrator stopped walking. He stared down the mouth of the dark hallway. There were dozens of identical, rotting wooden doors flanking the corridor. "Jessia," the narrator called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Where are you?" Almost instantly, a voice replied from a doorway, just 15 feet ahead, on the left side of the hall. In here, it wasn't Jesse this time. It was Jansen's voice. It was a perfect, casual replication of Jansen's own. The tension in the narrator's chest eased just a fraction. "They're messing with me," he thought. They ran ahead to set up a jump scare. Classic Jansen. He gripped his flashlight tight, forcing a tired smile, and walked toward the open doorway on the left. The room inside was a void, swallowing the ambient moonlight from the hallway. The narrator stepped over the threshold into the room. He raised his flashlight and swept the beam through the darkness. The blinding circle of light washed over the peeling walls, the collapsed ceiling tiles, and finally landed on the far corner of the room. Standing rigidly in the corner, facing the brick wall, was a figure. For one microscopic fraction of a second, the narrator's desperate brain tried to project his friend's face onto the silhouette. "It's Jansen. It's a prank. that the geometry was horribly, terrifyingly wrong. The figure facing the wall was massive. It possessed an elongated, grotesque frame, standing easily 6.5 feet tall, perhaps closer to 7. The proportions were unnatural. The shoulders were too wide, the limbs too long. Neither Jansen nor Jesse stood an inch over 5'9". The thing in the corner was absolutely, definitively not human. The narrator's brain short-circuited. A primal, guttural scream ripped itself from his throat. He didn't make a conscious decision to run. His body simply engaged in a violent flight response. He backpedaled out of the room, slamming into the hallway wall, dropping his flashlight, fumbling to retrieve it, and sprinting blindly back the way he came. He didn't care about stealth. He didn't care about the Coast Guard. He screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice staring at his vocal cords, hollering for Jansen and Jesse to run. He sprinted past the black, gaping maws of the patient rooms, absolutely convinced that the towering thing from the corner was unfolding itself, reaching out from the shadows to drag him into the dark. He burst back into the main ward just as Jansen and Jesse were emerging from a side room, looking bewildered. The sheer, unadulterated terror radiating off the narrator was contagious. Seeing their friend sprinting like a hunted animal, screaming incoherently, erased any skepticism they might have had. Wait. They didn't ask questions. They turned and ran with him. The three of them tore through the brush, branches whipping their faces, stumbling over exposed roots until they crashed into the muddy shoreline where the kayaks were hidden. Gasping for air, doubling over in the mud, the narrator managed to choke out what he had seen. The impossibly tall figure. The dark corner. Jansen and Jesse were terrified, but their logical brains were still fighting for control. They tried to suggest it was a trick of the light, a pile of debris casting a weird shadow. But as they grabbed the heavy plastic handles of the kayaks to drag them into the freezing water, the island delivered its final, horrifying blow. All three of them froze. Cutting through the dead silence of the night, originating from the dense, black tree line just 50 yards behind them, came a sound. It was faint, but agonizingly clear. It was the sound of a woman. An elderly woman. She was moaning. It was a wet, ragged sound, fluctuating between a pathetic, rhythmic weeping and the sharp, breathy winces of someone in profound, inescapable physical agony. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't the wind. It was human suffering, echoing out from a hospital that had been empty for 50 years. The debate was over. The boys shoved the kayaks violently into the river, throwing themselves into the cockpits, paddling with a desperate, frantic energy that burned their muscles to the point of failure. The paddle back to the Bronx felt like wading through wet cement. Every time the narrator glanced back over his shoulder, he expected to see a 7-foot silhouette standing at the edge of the water, watching them leave. They made it back to the park. They loaded the kayaks. During the long, silent Dr. Home, the adrenaline finally began to recede, leaving behind a cold, analytical dread as they tried to dissect the nightmare. Light. They agreed on the moaning woman. They all heard it. It was unexplainable. But as they sat in the glow of the dashboard lights, the narrator brought up the detail that permanently broke his reality. He turned to Jesse and asked, "Why did you call my name?" Jesse looked at him, confused. "I didn't." Like, the narrator explained the sequence of events. He explained how he heard Jesse's voice from down the hall, calling out to him, and then how he heard Jansen's voice, telling him to come inside the room. Jansen and Jesse went pale. Like, they swore on their lives that they had never left the main ward. They had been standing next to each other, messing with the spray paint, the entire time. Neither of them had spoken a single word until the narrator came screaming back into the room. Like, the narrator has never returned to North Brother Island. He never finished his thesis on the subject. He changed his topic the following week. He is an educated, rational man who actively rejects the concept of the paranormal. He does not believe in ghosts. But to this day he cannot explain what was hunting him in the dark. Because if it wasn't a ghost, the reality is infinitely more terrifying. It means that living in the rotting ruins of a quarantine island, completely isolated from human society, is a physical entity. An entity that stands nearly 7 feet tall. An entity that can perfectly mimic the exact tonal pitch of your best friend's voice. And most horrific of all, like an entity that somehow knew his name before he ever introduced himself to the dark.